Before the story begins, take a quiet moment and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Somewhere out there, someone else may be listening at the exact same moment, feeling the same emotions. Let's remind each other that none of us are alone in this. My name is Jasmine Porter, and I was 26 years old when I realized that my own family had slowly turned my apartment into something that felt less like a home and more like a hotel lobby with no front desk, no guest book, and no permission required. It didn't happen all at once. There was no broken window, no missing jewelry, no obvious sign that someone had crossed a line. What unsettled me came in quiet, almost polite details, the kind only the person who lives somewhere every single day would notice. I worked long shifts near the resorts in Orlando, the kind of work that leaves your feet aching and your head buzzing long after you clock out. By the time I drove back to my small one-bedroom apartment, the Florida heat usually still clung to my skin. I would drop my bag, kick off my sneakers by the door without thinking, and promise myself I would clean properly on my next day off. That rhythm was familiar, comforting even. It was my life, messy in small ways but entirely mine. So when I came home one evening and saw my sneakers lined up neatly against the wall, toes perfectly aligned, I paused. I told myself I must have done it before leaving that morning and forgotten. Exhaustion can blur memory, especially when every day starts to feel the same. In the kitchen, the mug I distinctly remembered leaving in the sink sat rinsed and upside down on the counter. The hallway smelled faintly of fabric softener I didn't use. A clean, floral scent that didn't belong to me. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. Still, the air felt different, like someone else's routine had brushed against mine and lingered. I laughed it off at first. I told myself I was being paranoid, that working near constant crowds and noise had made me oversensitive to quiet changes. I had just moved out on my own less than a year earlier. Maybe this was what living alone felt like. The strange awareness that no one else was there to confirm your memories. Maybe I wanted so badly to protect this space that my mind was inventing threats. Then I opened my fridge. On the middle shelf sat a glass container filled with casserole, still neatly wrapped, still warm enough to fog the plastic lid when I lifted it. Beside it were two stacked containers of leftovers I knew I hadn't ordered or paid for. On top of them lay a small yellow sticky note. The handwriting was rounded and familiar, looping letters that called me by a nickname I hadn't used since high school. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an apology. It read like a summary of something already decided, a quiet announcement that someone had been here and felt entitled to be. That was the moment my stomach dropped. It wasn't just that someone had entered my apartment. It was the realization that they had moved through it comfortably. They had opened my fridge, cleaned my dishes, decided what I should eat, and left without a word. This wasn't a quick stop to grab something forgotten. This was presence. This was familiarity. My parents had a spare key. They had insisted on it when I first signed the lease, calling it a safety measure, a way to sleep at night, knowing their daughter wasn't completely alone. At the time, I had been so focused on affording rent near work, on proving to myself that I could manage utilities and groceries and bills, that saying yes to the key felt easier than pushing back. Saying no would have meant explaining myself, justifying my independence before I even fully believed in it. So I agreed. It seemed harmless then. My younger sister, Marissa, knew exactly where that key was kept. As kids, she had always treated boundaries like soft suggestions rather than firm lines. She borrowed clothes without asking, slipped into rooms she'd been told to leave alone, and laughed it off when confronted. Seeing that same energy echoed in my own apartment made my chest tighten. There was a difference between sharing a hallway bathroom as teenagers and having her routine spill into the one part of my adult life that finally felt separate. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the note, feeling foolish for how long it had taken me to connect the dots. My apartment wasn't just a place I slept. It was the first thing I had built on my own. Every bill paid on time, every piece of furniture assembled. Every late-night collapse onto the couch after work had been proof that I was capable. Realizing that I was the last person to know when someone had been inside that space felt like having the ground tilt beneath my feet. Later that evening, once the initial shock faded, my mind started replaying everything with sharper clarity. The clean mug, the aligned shoes, the unfamiliar scent. None of it had been accidental. None of it had asked for my consent. And yet, a small voice in my head kept whispering that maybe I was overreacting. That family didn't need invitations. That I should be grateful someone cared enough to look after me. That internal argument exhausted me more than my shifts ever had. In the quiet, I thought about how often young adults are told that independence is something you earn, something granted gradually if you behave responsibly enough. I paid my rent, I worked full-time, I managed my own life, and still, a part of my family saw my home as an extension of theirs, a place they could step into whenever they decided it was necessary. Before I tell you what happened when I finally picked up the phone and said something out loud, let me ask you this. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching from? I've learned that stories like this have a way of traveling farther than we expect, finding people who recognize the feeling even before they recognize the details. That night, I ate the casserole standing at my counter, the taste unfamiliar but undeniably comforting. I washed the containers afterward and stacked them neatly, trying to convince myself that this was just what family did. That love sometimes looked like intrusion if you stared at it too hard. But as I turned off the lights and lay in bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic from the attractions nearby, one thought refused to settle. If this was meant to make me feel taken care of, why did it leave me feeling so small in my own home? The next morning, I woke up with the strange sensation that my apartment was no longer fully mine. Nothing had changed overnight. Not really. The walls were the same pale beige. The couch still sagged slightly in the middle where I always sat, and the hum of Orlando traffic outside followed its usual rhythm. Yet something inside me had shifted. I moved more carefully, as if the space were being observed, as if my habits were no longer private. I kept replaying the moment my mother insisted on the spare key. It had been the day I signed the lease, my hands shaking slightly as I scrawled my name at the bottom of the contract. She had smiled, proud and relieved at the same time, and said it was just in case. Storms, emergencies, late nights. She spoke in the language parents use when they frame control as protection. I remember nodding, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself that once I was settled, things would naturally shift. I didn't realize then how rarely those shifts happen unless someone forces them. By midday, the unease turned into something heavier, a pressure behind my ribs that made it hard to focus at work. Guests came and went, families laughing, kids sticky with melted ice cream, couples arguing quietly in line. I moved through my shift on autopilot, smiling when required, answering the same questions I always did. All the while, my mind kept drifting back to my fridge, my kitchen, the note written in looping letters that assumed access instead of asking for it. Calling my mother felt inevitable and impossible at the same time. I knew her voice well enough to predict how the conversation would go. There would be surprise, then reassurance, then a gentle dismissal of my concerns. She had always been good at that, at smoothing things over until I felt silly for bringing them up in the first place. Still, I couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened. By the time my shift ended, my decision was made. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving home, phone resting heavy in my hand. Even tapping her name made my chest tighten. When she answered, her voice was bright, efficient, already moving through her day. She asked how work was, whether I was eating properly, if I was getting enough rest. The questions piled up, affectionate but relentless, leaving little space for me to insert myself. I told her I had come home to signs that someone had been inside my apartment while I was at work. There was no pause, no confusion. She confirmed it immediately, almost cheerfully. She said she had stopped by to drop off food, that she had worried about me living on cereal and takeout. She talked about how hard I worked, how proud she was, how she just wanted to help. In her version of events, nothing unusual had happened. She had used the spare key for exactly what it was meant for. I tried to explain how it felt to walk into my own home and realize I hadn't been the last person there. I said it made me feel unsettled, like my apartment was something I borrowed instead of something I owned. As I spoke, I could hear my voice tighten, could feel myself trying to sound reasonable, calm, adult. I wasn't accusing her of malice. I was asking her to understand impact. She laughed softly, the way she always did when she thought I was overthinking. She told me I was being dramatic. That family shouldn't need an invitation. That worrying about privacy sounded like something I had picked up online. She said the internet filled young people's heads with strange ideas about independence and boundaries, as if those were trends instead of needs. By the time the call ended, my pulse was racing, and a familiar doubt crept in. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had blown it out of proportion. The food was good. The kitchen was cleaner than I'd left it. The practical benefits lined up neatly against my discomfort, making it harder to defend. For a few days, I tried to let it go. I ate the leftovers, thanked her in a text I didn't fully mean, and told myself that this was part of learning how to live alone. I reminded myself that many people my age leaned heavily on family, that needing help wasn't a failure. Yet each time I unlocked my door after work, my eyes scanned the room automatically. Each time I noticed something even slightly out of place, my stomach tightened. Living alone is supposed to teach you how your own space sounds when it's empty. Instead, I was learning how it felt to never be entirely sure it had stayed that way. I thought about Marissa more often, about how she had always moved through shared spaces without hesitation. Growing up, I had learned to adapt, to tuck my things away, to accept that privacy was negotiable. I had assumed that leaving home meant leaving that dynamic behind. It was unsettling to realize how easily it had followed me. The second time it happened, there was no room left for doubt. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where sunlight already warmed the balcony railings, and the noise from nearby attractions drifted lazily through the air. I woke up later than usual, grateful for a slow start. I planned to make coffee, take my time, maybe sit outside for a few minutes before getting ready for work. The moment I stepped into the bathroom, my body reacted before my mind did. The hair on my arms lifted. A sudden, instinctive warning. On the shelf inside the shower sat a bottle I had never bought. The label faced outward, carefully placed, as if it belonged there. The scent was sharp and expensive. A salon brand I recognized instantly because I had never been willing to pay for it myself. I didn't need to check the name. I knew exactly whose it was. Marissa had always loved small luxuries. She believed the right products, the right clothes, the right presentation mattered. Seeing that bottle in my shower snapped everything into focus with brutal clarity. Someone hadn't just entered my apartment again. They had showered there. They had unpacked toiletries. They had settled in. I checked the towel rack. One towel hung slightly crooked, still damp at the bottom. The bath mat sat at a different angle. My toothbrush had been nudged aside, just enough for me to notice. Each small detail carried the same message. This wasn't an emergency. This was convenience. The anger that rose in me felt different from before. It wasn't tangled with confusion or guilt. It was solid, heavy, and unmistakable. The first incident could almost be explained away as misguided help. This one revealed a pattern, one that treated my home like a shared resource instead of a personal boundary. Standing there, the smell of unfamiliar shampoo hanging in the air, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Intent does not erase impact. Love does not cancel consent. And being related to someone does not give them automatic access to your life. For the first time since I moved out, I didn't wonder whether I was overreacting. I knew exactly what this was. By the time I finished my shift that afternoon, the anger had settled into something steadier, colder. It wasn't the explosive kind that burns out quickly. It was the kind that stays, quietly organizing your thoughts, lining up memories you had ignored because they were inconvenient. As I drove back through Orlando traffic, neon signs flickering on one by one, I realized I wasn't just reacting to a shampoo bottle and a damp towel. I was reacting to a lifetime of being told that my comfort mattered less than other people's intentions. The apartment greeted me with the same deceptive calm. The door unlocked smoothly. The lights were off. Everything looked normal if you didn't know what to look for. But I knew now. I could feel it in my body, the way my shoulders stayed tense as I walked from room to room, cataloging what had shifted. It wasn't about catching them in the act anymore. It was about acknowledging that this had become a pattern, and that patterns don't disappear on their own. That night, I didn't call anyone. I sat at my small kitchen table with a glass of water, letting the quiet stretch. I thought about how often women are taught to doubt their instincts, especially when those instincts conflict with family expectations. We're told to be flexible, to be understanding, to appreciate help even when it costs us peace. Saying no is framed as selfish. Drawing a line is treated like an overreaction. I had absorbed those lessons so deeply that even now, with clear evidence in front of me, part of me still wanted permission to be upset. The next day, I decided I needed to speak to them in person. Driving to my parents' house felt like slipping backward in time. The closer I got to their quiet street on the edge of town, the more my adult life seemed to blur at the edges. My apartment, my job, my bills. All of it felt suddenly fragile compared to the weight of that familiar driveway. By the time I parked, my hands were tight on the steering wheel. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I knew if I did, I'd talk myself out of it. My mother opened the door with the same surprised smile she used when neighbors stopped by unannounced. She reached out for a hug, but I stepped past her, moving straight toward the kitchen. That space held decades of family dinners, arguments, reconciliations that never quite resolved anything. My feet knew the way without thinking. Marissa was already there, sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, grinned, and gave a casual wave, like I'd come over just to hang out. That ease made something twist in my chest. To her, this wasn't a confrontation. It was just another day where she assumed access. "I want the spare key back," I said. The words came out flat, stripped of apology or explanation. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then my mother's expression shifted. Her brows lowered, her mouth tightening into a line I knew too well. It was the look that said I had crossed some invisible boundary of my own. "Why?" she asked. "It's for emergencies." She said the word like it ended the conversation. Emergencies, storms, late nights, living alone near tourist areas. Every example came fast, stacked one on top of the other, each framed as a reason she deserved access. Not once did she ask how I felt. Not once did she consider that an emergency should be rare, not routine. I told her calmly that an emergency didn't include cleaning my kitchen or letting my sister shower at my place. I said I didn't feel safe knowing people had been inside my home without telling me. As I spoke, I watched her face harden further, hurt turning into indignation. She wasn't hearing concern. She was hearing accusation. Marissa finally put her phone down. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with a look that suggested I was making a mountain out of nothing. She said they were only trying to help, that Mom worried because I worked so much, that it was easier for her to stop by than to nag me about eating properly. In her world, helpful people didn't need permission. Gratitude was assumed. I looked from my sister to my mother and felt something settle inside me with uncomfortable clarity. In their minds, my apartment wasn't really mine. It was an extension of this house. Another room they had the right to walk into. My independence was conditional, something they tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with their sense of involvement. The door from the garage opened, and my father walked in, wiping his hands on an old towel. He took in the scene quickly, the tension hanging in the air. Growing up, he had always been the one who smoothed things over, who convinced my mother to compromise or Marissa to back down. A part of me still hoped he would do that now. Instead, he listened as my mother explained that I wanted the key back. She framed it carefully, leaving out the details that made everything feel invasive. She made it sound like I was pushing them away, like I was rejecting their care. When she finished, the room went quiet again. I repeated myself. I said my apartment was not a shared resource. I said I couldn't relax knowing someone else could open my door whenever they chose. I waited for my father to speak. He sighed, the tired, disappointed sound that used to come before lectures about responsibility. "We're not giving it back," he said. There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, just finality. That was the moment I understood there was nothing left to negotiate. Even the person I believed might understand saw my need for privacy as unreasonable. They didn't see two adult daughters with separate lives. They saw extensions of themselves, parts that were still supposed to remain accessible. The rest of the visit blurred together. My mother cycled through tears and sharp comments. Marissa returned to her phone, shaking her head as if I were ridiculous. My father poured coffee, set out snacks, acted like the decision had been made and life could continue as usual. I stayed long enough to know that nothing I said would change their minds. On the drive back to my apartment, the late afternoon sun hit my windshield so hard I had to squint, but my focus felt sharper than it had in weeks. They weren't going to hand back control. If I wanted to feel safe in my own home, I would have to take it. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I opened my laptop and searched for locksmiths who worked weekends. I wrote down names and numbers on a notepad, circling one that seemed reliable. The decision felt heavy, but it also felt clear. Changing the lock wouldn't fix how my family saw me, but it would close at least one door they believed still belonged to them. And for the first time since I'd moved out, that felt like a start. The locksmith arrived the next afternoon, his white van pulling into the parking lot just as the Florida heat reached its peak. I watched from my balcony as he stepped out, tools in hand, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. It struck me as strange how ordinary the moment looked from the outside. Nothing about it hinted at the weight it carried for me. Inside, I paced while he worked, the sharp clicks of metal echoing through my small apartment. Each sound landed heavier than it should have, as if the door itself were protesting the change. When he finished, he handed me 3 new keys. They were plain, identical, unremarkable, and yet, holding them felt like holding proof of something I had been denied for years. "This door answers only to you now," he said. More statement than reassurance. I thanked him, closed the door behind him, and locked it. The final click settled something in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, hands still on the knob, listening. The apartment was quiet. Not the uneasy quiet I'd grown used to, but a stillness that felt earned. That relief lasted less than 24 hours. The first sign came in the form of a missed call from my mother, followed by a text that said, "Did you change your lock?" The question wasn't framed with concern. It was sharp, immediate, accusatory. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to explain myself again, to justify a decision I'd already made. Silence, I hoped, would buy me a little space. Instead, it escalated. By evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Calls from my parents, messages from Marissa, alternating between irritation and disbelief. She wrote that Mom had tried to stop by and couldn't get in, that it was embarrassing, that neighbors had noticed. There it was again. Their discomfort, centered and magnified. While mine remained invisible, I sat on my couch, phone face down, reminding myself that discomfort wasn't danger. I was allowed to make choices that upset people, even people I loved, especially when those choices protected me. The next day, I went down to the leasing office. The assistant property manager, Evan, looked up from his computer when I approached the desk. His badge caught the light as he stood. Polite and professional, I explained that I'd replaced my lock and needed my file updated. I kept the details minimal. I lived alone. I'd changed the hardware. I didn't want anyone allowed into my unit unless I personally requested it. As I spoke, my voice wavered despite my efforts to keep it steady. Saying it out loud made it real in a way planning never had. Evan listened without interrupting, nodding as he pulled up my account. He explained that the complex kept a master key for emergencies like fire or flooding, not for convenience, and that staff weren't supposed to unlock units just because a relative asked. When I asked what happened if someone claimed I was sick or unreachable, he stopped typing. "Technically, we still say no," he said. "People can make anything sound urgent. If you'd like, I can put a note on your account. No access for anyone but you." Hearing that felt like oxygen. I said yes immediately. He typed a brief line, then turned the monitor so I could see it. My name sat beside the words "Authorized Resident Only." Simple, clear, unambiguous. For the first time since this started, I felt backed up by something solid, Something procedural that didn't care about family dynamics or emotional arguments. For a few days, life returned to something like normal. I went to work, came home, unlocked my door with the new key, and found everything exactly as I'd left it. No unfamiliar smells, no rearranged objects. My phone still lit up with messages, but I didn't answer all of them. The quiet inside my apartment slowly lost its edge. I started believing that maybe this had been enough. Maybe the lock and the office note had finally communicated what my words hadn't. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday evening. I'd worked a double shift and was bone-tired by the time I pushed my door open. The air inside was cool, the lights off, the mail still stacked where I'd left it. For a second, I relaxed. Then a faint floral scent drifted through the room, something sweet and artificial, like a candle I didn't own. In the kitchen, the trash can had been emptied and rebagged. The pan I'd left soaking that morning stood dry on the rack. On the counter sat a stack of takeout containers from a restaurant near my parents' neighborhood. My bedroom door was open, the bed made tighter than I ever bothered to make it. A sweater I remembered dropping over a chair now hung in the closet. My mail had been sorted into neat piles. On the coffee table lay a handwritten note. The rounded letters were instantly familiar. This time, there was no attempt to sound casual. She wrote that she had spoken with the front office, that they understood a mother's concern, that she'd worked it out so she could get in if she needed to check on me. I stood there, note in hand, feeling something inside me go very still. They hadn't just ignored my boundary. They'd gone around it. They'd found a way to bend the building itself to their will, convincing someone else that their worry mattered more than my consent. The lock was intact. The system had failed. The next morning, I went straight back to the leasing office. Evan looked up as soon as he saw me. Whatever he read on my face made him stand. I set the note on his desk. He read it carefully, his jaw tightening. He asked who had let my mother into the unit after the account had been flagged. I told him the note said she'd worked it out with the front office. He pulled up the key usage log and the visitor sign-in sheet. There it was, my last name, misspelled. A vague description instead of proper identification. Someone at the desk had decided that a worried parent deserved access more than the person paying rent. Evan apologized in a way my family never had. He said the staff member would be written up and retrained. Then he added another note to my account. This one in capital letters, the kind that left no room for interpretation. He offered to email me a copy. Walking back upstairs, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The building was finally on my side. My family was not. That night, I locked the chain inside my door for the first time since moving in. When footsteps passed in the hallway, I paused until they faded. Safety, I was learning, isn't just about locks and policies. It's about knowing who respects the word no, and my family, no matter how much they claimed to love me, had made it clear they didn't. For a few days after the office incident, I lived in a strange in-between state. On paper, everything was secure. The lock was new. My account was flagged in bold, unmistakable terms. The staff knew what had happened and promised it wouldn't happen again. Logically, I should have felt safe. Emotionally, I felt like someone who had just realized the door they kept barricading wasn't the real entrance being used against them. I started locking the chain every time I came home, a habit I'd never needed before. It made a soft metallic rattle when I slid it into place, a sound that followed me through the apartment. At night, I lay in bed listening more closely than I ever had, learning the difference between footsteps that passed my door and footsteps that slowed near it. Each noise woke something alert inside me, something that refused to settle. Work became my refuge. The crowds, the noise, the constant movement near the attractions felt oddly safer than the quiet of my own living room. At least there, nothing was personal. At least there, no one pretended their access to me was a right. On Thursday afternoon, I left early after a shorter shift and drove home while the sun was still high. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed two familiar silhouettes near the pedestrian gate. They stood just far enough away to look casual, shaded by a small palm tree that offered more symbolism than protection. My chest tightened before my brain fully registered what I was seeing. My mother and my sister. They weren't using the keypad. They weren't knocking on the office door. They were waiting. I parked a few spaces down and stayed in my car, watching. They glanced toward the gate every time someone approached it, their posture alert, practiced. An older couple arrived pushing a stroller, juggling bags and keys. They typed in the code. The gate buzzed, and as it swung open, my mother stepped forward smoothly, holding it with a polite smile. Marissa slipped in behind her, not touching the metal, not needing to. Just like that, they were inside. They hadn't broken a rule. They hadn't picked a lock. They had simply used someone else's access. It was stubbornness disguised as persistence, entitlement dressed up as determination. I felt something hollow open in my chest as I watched the gate close behind them. Locked doors mean nothing to people who don't believe they apply. I waited a few minutes before getting out of my car. My hands were steady on the key, but my stomach churned as I walked toward the building. By the time I reached my floor, I could hear voices through my door. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the living room in slow, familiar passes. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, they were already settled. My mother had rearranged the throw pillows, folding the blanket I kept draped over the back of the couch with careful precision. Marissa's tote bag sat open on the armchair, half full of clothes and makeup, like she was preparing for an overnight stay. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Mom commented on how tired I looked, her voice thick with concern. She asked if work was burning me out. Marissa picked up a pair of heels that weren't mine and asked where she should leave them so they wouldn't be in the way. It felt unreal, like walking into a scene that had been rehearsed without me. I told them, again, that they couldn't come and go like this. I reminded them that I'd changed the locks, spoken to the office, and made it clear that no one else was allowed inside my apartment. My voice stayed calm, even the way you speak, when you're trying not to escalate something that already feels out of control. My mother waved it off. She said the gate had been open. She said she was just helping, just cleaning, just making sure I was okay. Marissa added that she needed somewhere closer to the part of town she liked to go out in at night, and that my place made sense. To them, this wasn't intrusion. It was efficiency. In their version of reality, I was being stubborn and ungrateful. In mine, they were standing in the middle of my home, explaining why my boundaries mattered less than their convenience. I realized then that I wasn't arguing with people who misunderstood me. I was arguing with people who didn't intend to change. They left eventually, my mother hugging me tightly despite my stiff posture, my sister rolling her eyes as she slung her tote over her shoulder. When the door closed behind them, the silence felt fragile, as if it could shatter with the next knock. I walked through the apartment slowly, noticing everything they had touched. The couch cushions shifted. The kitchen counter wiped clean in a way that erased my morning mess. The hallway where they had passed other residents who assumed they belonged there. Each detail pressed the same conclusion deeper into me. Locks hadn't stopped them. Notes on a file hadn't stopped them. Conversations hadn't stopped them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the sky darkened into something heavy and blue, I sat on the floor of my living room and let myself finally acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. As long as my family knew where I lived, they would find ways to cross the line and call it love. They would keep testing the edges, keep pushing until resistance exhausted me. Safety, I was learning, isn't just about defending a space. Sometimes it's about leaving it. The idea of moving felt drastic, almost dramatic. I had just settled in. I knew the shortcuts, the sounds, the rhythm of this place. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, but staying started to feel less like strength and more like a dare, as if I were challenging them to see how far they could go. That night, I opened my laptop and began scrolling through apartment listings. Not casually this time, but with intent. I filtered for buildings with controlled access, interior hallways, policies that didn't bend easily. I wanted a place that didn't feel like a resort. A place that believed doors should stay closed unless someone inside chose to open them. One listing on the far edge of Orlando caught my eye. The photos were plain, almost boring. But the description mattered more. Locked lobby. Guests buzzed in from upstairs. No courtesy codes. No exceptions. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. For the first time since this began, I wasn't planning my next defense. I was planning an exit. Once the idea of leaving took root, it spread quickly, filling the spaces where doubt had been. I tried to tell myself I was being impulsive, that moving again so soon would be expensive and exhausting. But each time I imagined staying, I felt the same tightness return to my chest. This apartment no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a place under siege, one where I was constantly bracing for the next breach. During breaks at work, I scrolled through listings instead of social media. I skimmed past bright photos and trendy descriptions, looking instead for the details most people ignored. Interior hallways, controlled entry, buzz-in systems, policies spelled out in plain language. I wasn't looking for luxury, I was looking for resistance. One building on the far edge of Orlando kept pulling my attention back. The photos were unremarkable. Beige walls, simple appliances, nothing designed to impress. But the description mentioned a locked lobby and a policy that required residents to authorize every guest. No courtesy access, no exceptions for worried relatives. It read less like marketing and more like a promise. I scheduled a tour for the following morning. The leasing agent walked me through the space with practiced ease, pointing out square footage and parking options. I nodded politely, but my real focus was on the doors. The way the lobby clicked shut behind us, the absence of shortcuts. When I asked how they handled people who arrived insisting they needed to check on someone, she didn't hesitate. Unless a name is on the lease, we can't release information or unlock anything. If there's a real emergency, authorities handle it. Her answer settled something in me. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was procedural, neutral, unyielding. I filled out the application that same day and signed the lease before I could talk myself out of it. The move-in date was just a few weeks away, long enough to prepare, short enough to keep me from losing my nerve. I didn't tell my family. Instead, I told two friends I trusted, Dana and Na. They had never met my parents or my sister, which made explaining everything easier. There were no loyalties pulling them in opposite directions, no instinct to smooth things over. They listened, asked practical questions, and offered help without trying to reinterpret my experience. We picked a weekday morning to move, a time when most people would be at work, quiet, efficient. I rented a small van and filed my notice with the current complex online. I marked the move-out date on a calendar I kept tucked in a drawer, a private countdown I checked each night. Packing became a ritual. Every evening, I boxed up a little more of my life. Dishes wrapped carefully in towels, books stacked and taped shut, clothes folded with more intention than usual. I slid the boxes into my bedroom closet, out of sight, so there would be nothing obvious if someone decided to drop by unannounced. Each box felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming control piece by piece. On moving day, the air was already heavy before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Dana backed the van up to the stairwell while Na started carrying lighter loads. I took the heavier boxes, grateful for the physical strain that kept my mind occupied. Each trip down the stairs unwound a bit of the tension I'd been carrying for months. Halfway through, I saw Evan in the hallway. He asked if I was transferring to another unit. I told him I was moving to a different complex and thanked him for taking my concerns seriously when I'd asked him to lock down my file. Before he walked away, I asked one last thing. If my family came by after I left, I wanted them told only that I no longer lived there. Once I turn in your keys, he said, there won't be anything we can share. You'll be off the system. That mattered more than he probably realized. By midday, my apartment was empty. Pale rectangles marked where frames had hung. The counters were wiped clean. I walked through each room slowly, checking corners, drawers, and closets, making sure I hadn't left behind anything that could later be used as an excuse to contact me. There was a strange grief in that final walkthrough, not for the space itself, but for what I had hoped it could be. At the office, I handed over my keys and signed the move-out form. I repeated my request that no forwarding information be given to anyone who asked, even if they shared my last name. The clerk nodded and marked the unit vacant. The new building felt different immediately. When the lobby door clicked shut behind me for the first time, the sound was solid, decisive, I carried a box into the empty living room and set it down, noticing the echo of my own footsteps. The silence here felt earned, not fragile. It didn't flinch at the idea of being disturbed. Settling in took a few days. I built a small bookcase, arranged my dishes, learned which headlights belonged to neighbors and which belonged to passing traffic. My phone buzzed constantly, missed calls, texts that ranged from casual to sharp, demanding to know why I wasn't answering. I let them stack up, unread. A few days after the move, an email from Evan appeared in my inbox. He wrote that 3 people had come to the old complex asking for me, insisting they were family. They wanted to know where I was and whether I was safe. The staff told them only that the unit was empty and that no information could be shared. He described the scene briefly: my mother raising her voice, my sister pacing the lobby, my father pressing for details until the conversation ended. Reading it, I could picture them standing at that desk, frustrated that a building treated them like strangers at a closed door. For the first time, the distance between us wasn't just emotional, it was physical, procedural, enforced. I closed the email and set my phone face down on the table, letting the quiet stretch. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of something new, something I hadn't allowed myself before: space. The silence didn't last as long as I hoped it would. A few days after Evan's email, my phone rang with a number I knew by heart. I stared at the screen until it stopped vibrating, then rang again almost immediately. I let it go to voicemail, my chest tight, my mind racing through all the things I could say and all the ways the conversation could twist itself into something familiar and painful. When the phone finally went quiet, I sat there, listening to the hum of the air conditioner in my new apartment, trying to remind myself why I had left. An hour later, I listened to the voicemail. My mother's voice filled the room, sharp with indignation, trembling just enough to sound wounded. She said they had gone to my old complex and been treated terribly. She said no one would tell them anything, that the staff acted like she was a stranger. She asked why I would disappear without telling them, why I would make it so difficult for my own parents to reach me. Beneath her words, I could hear something else. Not fear, not concern, loss of control. The phone rang again the next day. This time, I answered. She started talking before I could say hello, her words tumbling over each other. She repeated the story about the complex, about how embarrassing it was, about how she and my father had only wanted to make sure I was safe. When she paused, my father's voice replaced hers, calmer but heavier. He asked where I was living now, why I had moved so suddenly, why I hadn't told them. They sounded less like people checking in and more like supervisors demanding a report. I told them I was safe. I told them I had moved across town. I told them the new building didn't share resident information and that I had asked my old complex to do the same. My voice stayed steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't explain myself beyond that. I didn't justify. I didn't apologize. There was a short silence. Then my mother asked why I would make it so hard for my own parents to reach me. She said if I had just given them a new key, none of this would have happened. The words landed exactly where she intended them to. Blame, neatly folded and handed back to me. When I didn't respond right away, the familiar labels followed: ungrateful, dramatic, cruel. My father said I was taking things too far. That family didn't treat each other this way. My sister's voice cut in, sharper now. She said everyone she knew leaned on family, that I was turning independence into some kind of performance, that I should be grateful anyone wanted to show up for me at all. Listening to them, something in me finally settled. I realized I wasn't going to find understanding here. Every explanation I offered would be reframed as an accusation against them. Every boundary would be recast as rejection. They weren't confused about what I wanted. They just didn't agree that I was allowed to want it. I told them that what they called help had felt like inspection, that walking into my home while I was at work, letting my sister use it as a stopover without asking, slipping through the gate after being told no, were not acts of care. I said those choices told me they didn't see me as an adult with a door of my own. My mother started to cry. My father sighed. the same sound he used to make when I disappointed him as a teenager. My sister scoffed, muttering that I was unbelievable. Their reactions washed over me without pulling me under. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. I told them I wasn't giving them my new address. I told them that if they tried to track me down through my workplace or my building, I would treat it as harassment, not concern. The word changed the air on the line. It was heavy, legal, uncomfortably adult. Before ending the call, I said one last thing. If they ever wanted a relationship with me again, it would have to be on different terms. No keys, no surprise visits, no treating my home like shared property. Calls only if invited. Messages that didn't demand immediate answers. If they couldn't accept that, I needed distance. Then I hung up. My hands shook as I blocked their numbers. The action felt both final and strangely small. Just a few taps on a screen. The weight of it came afterward, settling into my shoulders, my chest, my breath. I sat on the floor of my new living room and let myself feel it. The grief, the relief, the quiet fear that I had just severed something I couldn't repair. In the days that followed, I tightened the rest of my life around that choice. I locked down my social media, adjusted privacy settings, and asked a few trusted friends not to share information about me without checking first. It felt strange to build walls against people whose faces filled every photo album from my childhood. But it also felt necessary. Time moved on without them. I worked, I came home, I learned the sounds of my building, the way footsteps echoed in the hall, the rhythm of the elevator. Some evenings I ate takeout on the couch. Others I cooked simple meals and let the silence stretch. Holidays came and went. Sometimes I spent them with coworkers who had nowhere else to go. Sometimes I spent them alone, choosing movies without compromise, enjoying the freedom of not being observed. Occasionally, an email slipped through from a cousin or an aunt. They said my parents were hurt and confused. They asked if I would reconsider, if I would just talk to them. I replied once, with a single sentence. I am safe. I hope they are well. I am not ready for contact. The consequences for my family weren't dramatic. They kept their house, their routines, their stories about being good parents. What they lost was access, no spare key to borrow, no apartment to treat as a landing pad, no way to step over my threshold simply because they felt entitled to. The consequence for me was quieter, but real. I had to grieve the parents I wished I had and the sister I wished I could trust with a door code. I had to accept that some people would rather lose you than learn how to respect you. And I had to learn, slowly, that I didn't need to shrink myself to keep them comfortable. That realization didn't bring peace all at once, but it brought clarity. And clarity, I was learning, is its own kind of freedom. Clarity doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly, often after the noise fades, when there's finally enough space to hear your own thoughts. In the weeks after I blocked my family's numbers, my life didn't transform into something dramatic or cinematic. There was no sudden happiness, no triumphant sense of victory. What I felt instead was something steadier and more unfamiliar. I felt unobserved. I began to notice how much energy I had spent managing other people's expectations, how often I'd anticipated reactions before making even small decisions. In my new apartment, those habits lingered at first. I would pause before leaving dishes in the sink, before turning on music too late, before rearranging furniture. It took time to remember that no one was coming to inspect the space. No one was keeping score. Work continued as it always had. Guests came and went. The same questions, the same smiles. But I noticed a difference in myself. I wasn't carrying the same tension home with me. When I unlocked my door at night, I didn't brace for discovery. If something had moved, it was because I had moved it. That simple certainty felt like a luxury. Some evenings, loneliness crept in unexpectedly, not because I missed the chaos, but because cutting contact forced me to face what I had lost alongside what I'd gained. I missed the idea of family more than the reality of it. I missed the version where concern didn't come with control, where love didn't require access. Letting go of that fantasy hurt more than any argument ever had. I thought often about how boundaries are talked about in theory versus how they feel in practice. Online, they're framed as empowering, clean, decisive. in real life. They're messy. They come with guilt, with doubt, with long nights wondering if you've misunderstood everything. But they also come with something rare: honesty. I didn't cut contact to punish anyone. I did it because every other option had required me to give up my sense of safety. That wasn't a dramatic choice. It was a practical one. Over time, the quiet settled into something comfortable. I started inviting friends over without worrying about timing or appearances. I left my shoes wherever they landed. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, even when no one was there to hear it. The apartment slowly became what I had hoped my first one would be: a place where my nervous system could finally rest. Once, months later, I ran into a neighbor in the lobby. We exchanged small talk about weather and parking. Nothing memorable. As we parted, I realized something that made me smile. No one here knew my family. No one here saw me as an extension of anyone else. I was just another resident, another person with a key and a right to privacy. That anonymity felt like respect. I don't believe cutting contact is the right answer for everyone. There are families who listen when you say no, who adjust, who learn. If you have that, I hope you protect it. But if you don't, I hope you know that wanting privacy doesn't make you ungrateful. Wanting safety doesn't make you cruel. And choosing distance doesn't mean you've failed at family. Sometimes, it means you've finally succeeded at taking care of yourself. If any part of my story feels familiar, I hope it gives you permission to take your own needs seriously, to plan your boundaries instead of apologizing for them, to trust the quiet voice that tells you when something isn't right, even if the people crossing the line insist they mean well. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you feel like sharing, I'd like to hear how you think about family and boundaries. And if you want to hear more stories like this, I hope you stick around for the next one. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the very end. If what you just heard resonated with you, if you've ever felt hurt, overlooked, or forced to fight quietly for your own sense of safety, please know that you are not alone. Here on Vengeance Within, we tell stories about boundaries, awakening, buried pain, and the inner strength it takes to finally stand up for yourself. Each story is a journey of confrontation, healing, and reclaiming control over one's own life. If these stories speak to you, please subscribe to Vengeance Within, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support allows us to keep creating powerful, emotionally honest stories that stay with you long after the video ends. We'll see you again in the next story.